Good morning. Welcome back. We are continuing in our journey through the Gospel of John. It's good to see you this morning. And of course, I can't really see you, but I can pretend. I'm looking right through my camera and I can see your beady little eyes looking at me with your pens and your Bibles and your brains engaged and ready to share together in this time of inquiry, a time of discovery, a time of learning. And as I've shared with you several times, the study of the Gospel of John has long been a passion of mine, but I've treated it with a lot of respect over the years too, because I've been a little bit afraid of some of the concepts and not sure that I had a full understanding of everything that's here. But I suppose if I wait until I fully understand it all, I will never teach it, and nobody else will either. So that is the remarkable nature of studying the Bible. Is inevitably the more you jump into it, the deeper the water, the deeper you want to go. And it's surely that way for me in this case. Now, we have been on a journey. So far, we're concluding today, hopefully, with chapter 4. We have looked at the first two ministry cycles of Jesus as he labored and worked in first century Palestine. And you'll recall with me that what we said these cycles represent are Jesus taking journeys from his hometown of Galilee down to Judea and then returning back to Galilee. And these were usually associated with the various feasts of the Jews. In cycle 1, which was largely the last half of chapter 1 in John, and then also the first 11, 12 verses in chapter 2, we saw Jesus at the baptizing location of John the Baptist, which was Bethany on the other side of Jordan. And after that, he circled his way back up to Cana, where he performed a miracle, changing water into wine, and then he returned to what appears to have been his home base, which was Capernaum, a city along the seacoast of the Sea of Galilee. Well, really the lake shore. Sea of Galilee is in all regards a large lake. Okay, so that was cycle 1. And now today we are going to hopefully conclude cycle 2. And cycle 2 began down in Jerusalem. Jesus had gone there for Passover. The first thing that's recorded for us when he arrives in Jerusalem is he cleans the temple out and throws out the money changers and those who were distorting the purpose and the role of the temple. And after that, then he was confronted by the Pharisees and the leaders of the Jews, and they had their first skirmish. Then he then he continues to stay in Jerusalem for a few days anyhow, and he performs many miracles, and people begin to believe in who Jesus is. Following that, as we move into chapter 3, Jesus is still in Jerusalem, and he meets with Nicodemus at night, a respected teacher of Israel, a leader of the Jews, a scholar, a member of the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish ruling council, and he met with Nicodemus to discuss who he was. But the point that came out of that discussion primarily was that one must be born again from above in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, and that rebirth process was a rebirth of water and spirit. Okay, and that was what we got out of that session. Then following that time, Jesus moves out into the Judean countryside, and he and his disciples are baptizing and converting many, apparently, but there arises a little bit of rivalry or contention between Jesus' camp and the camp of John the Baptist. And so the Baptist, we hear his final testimony as he points to Jesus as the one that he was really preparing the way for. Okay, and that's also in chapter 3. Then following this time spent in the Judean wilderness, Jesus works his way back through Samaria, and that's where we've been the past several weeks. We've been talking about Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well and how he offered her living water, and eventually he brings her to a point of belief, a point of faith, where he reveals to her that he is the prophet that was expected both in the Jewish religious practice and in the Samaritan religious practice. And so Jesus makes the truth claim that I am indeed the Messiah to this woman. The woman then takes the story into her hometown, and Jesus ends up staying in that town for 2 more days, and many are brought to a point of faith, a point of belief in Samaria as well. Now today what we're going to pick up with is the return of Jesus back up to Cana. And it's interesting, you need to see this parallel, that this cycle ends in the same place that the first cycle ended, which is in Cana of Galilee. And John he takes pains to point that out to us, which we will get into in a little bit here. So here's what we see in cycle 2. I've called this cycle Jesus going public, as he spreads his news and his mission throughout Palestine to different groups. It started in Jerusalem at Passover, where he cleared the temple, did many miracles, and then had a meeting with Nicodemus. He went out into the Judean countryside, where he reinforced the complementary nature of his and John the Baptist's ministries and the fact that they were working together. They were not rivals. And then he worked his way through Samaria, meeting the woman at the well and converting many as they heard not only the woman's testimony, but then they also heard Jesus teaching as well. And now today we get down to what occurs in the town of Cana. So, I want for us to think just a minute as we see Jesus is now returning up to Galilee, to his hometown. I want us to think for a minute about the different receptions that he has received on this trip, on this journey. And of course it started in Jerusalem. How was Jesus received in Jerusalem? Well, there were a lot of different reactions to Jesus. There were some who were incredibly angered by his actions. When you think about him coming in and literally making such a big scene in the temple and overthrowing the tables and kicking out those who are selling animals and things, that caused a problem for some of the Jewish leaders and the Jewish establishment. But not everybody was on that side of the coin. There were many who were coming to accept Jesus. Some saw his miracles that he was doing there, and the Bible tells us that they began to believe, okay? So there were some who were coming to accept Jesus. We can imagine that his actions in the temple that were so anger-invoking to some were also a call to the common folk that, hey, this guy's really on my side, because we talked about all the ways they were being abused by the religious leaders. So here's a popular leader emerging from among the common folk. And then in Jerusalem, we also see people like Nicodemus. And these are people who are puzzled. They're curious, but they're puzzled. They're really not sure what to do with Jesus and what to think about him. It's quite a dilemma they find themselves in. I'm not exactly sure how I should react to you, Jesus. And so there are people like that. Well, that's the story in Jerusalem. Then when he goes through Samaria, think about his reception there. And we learned that many believed, including the woman, of course, who believed and had the private audience with Jesus. But then the woman goes back to town. She gives her testimony to her neighbors. She invites them to come out and see Jesus, which they do, and then he spends 2 more days there, and he continues to generate belief. His actions, his teaching, those things are causing people to believe in him. And by the end of the time in Samaria, the last thing that we read in chapter 4, verse 42, her neighbors say to her, "We no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we've heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world." And so they have come to believe him. And in fact, of all the people that we've read about so far, this is the greatest and deepest statement of faith. There's much more faith reflected in that statement than there is in anything that Nicodemus says, or anything else that was said in Jerusalem. So it's interesting that he gets that kind of a reception in Samaria. But now he returns home to Galilee. And so as we're looking at, well, let's put the outline up here. This is all going to be about his return to Cana. And it's going to be chapter 4, verses 43 through 54. And the first section we're going to look at is his Galilean reception. And this will be chapter 4, verses 43 through, I think, 45. Correct, 45. So let's read that together. Once again, I encourage you to have a Bible with you and a notepad or a pencil that you don't mind marking up your Bible with, because there's just a lot of information here. But let's read John 4, 43 through 45. After the 2 days, and this is referring to the 2 days that he spent in Samaria, okay? After those 2 days, he left for Galilee. Now Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet has no honor in his own country. But when he arrived in Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him. They had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, for they also had been there. So whereas we've looked at some of his reception in Jerusalem and then in Samaria, where some were accepting of him, some were lesser accepting, some were puzzled, some were opposed to him. Here it appears that he was received in general in a positive way. But in verse 44, John, the author of the gospel, reminds us of something that Jesus had said. And let's take a look at that for a second. Now, Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet has no honor in his own country. And I can remember, this goes way back into my childhood, that somebody was brought in to an organization that I was attending, and he was brought in, and he was brought in as an expert. And he didn't really have anything different to say than our usual teacher or leader would usually say. But I remember my dad telling me that because he came from more than 50 miles away, that made him an expert. Well, I took a look this last week, and I've got a couple of other definitions of what an expert is. And Mark Twain said, an expert is an ordinary fellow from another town. Mm-hmm. So he doesn't really have any expertise other that's unique to him, but he's just from farther away. And then Will Rogers said, an expert is a man 50 miles from home with a briefcase. So this tells us what an expert is. And, you know, that's kind of what Jesus was saying about himself. In my hometown, in my home region, I'm not going to be regarded as a prophet, as something unique, as something unusual. And it points out to us that for the Galileans, faith may have been more difficult than for others because they'd known Jesus for a long time. They were familiar with him. They had seen, they'd seen him grow up. I don't know how often he got into trouble with different things. Nobody does. We know very little of his childhood. But nonetheless, they had seen him, they knew him. And it's kind of remarkable that John says, in spite of that, when Jesus arrived in Galilee in verse 45, the Galileans welcomed him. And these Galileans had also been in Jerusalem. So when Jesus had been in Jerusalem and he had cleared out the temple, when he had answered the Pharisees and the leaders who were opposing him, when he had been doing the miracles, there were Galileans there also, because remember, it was expected of a Galilean male especially that they would go to Jerusalem for each of the 3 major feasts every year. And so there would have been many Galileans with Jesus in Jerusalem at the time. All right, so these individuals had seen many of the miraculous signs that Jesus was doing. And I think one of the things that we can pick up on here is that John wants us to see that faith is multifactorial. There are a lot of different things that generate faith and cause it to develop and grow. But one thing that he's pointing out right now to us is that a casual acquaintance, previous acquaintance, a casual, let's use this word, familiarity. If you knew Jesus as a lad, that might make it less likely that you would come to a point of faith. Okay? But in the course of looking at this cycle of events, we see some other things too. We see that Jesus performs miracles. And those miracles we've talked previously are really signs. They're to point to us about who Jesus really is. And so those miracles and signs tend to increase the likelihood of faith. Okay? Precedent or repetition. Being around Jesus more than once. So, for example, these people in Cana, they had seen Jesus turn water to wine, or at least they'd heard of it, and then later on, now as we come to today's lesson, we're going to see that he does a remote distance healing. Okay? And the fact that he's repetitive in these supernatural events, that increases one's chances of faith. And then also, something else that increases the chances of faith are witness or testimony. And we can pull that from the encounter in Samaria, because the woman's testimony was what aroused the curiosity in her townfolk and in her friends. And so it was the woman's testimony. So John is wanting us to see that faith is not a one-size-fits-all product. It's variable. There are a lot of different factors that come into it. One's past life experience, of course, plays into it as well. So there are many different things that play into this. All right, so he's received generally in a positive way as he returns to Galilee. Next, we see a royal official appear, and he pleads essentially for the life of his son. And this is verses 46 through 50. 46 through 50. Okay? And let's read that now. Once more, he, Jesus, visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned the water into wine. And there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son, who was close to death. Unless you people see miraculous signs and wonders, Jesus told him, you will never believe. And the royal official said, Sir, come down before my child dies. And Jesus replied, you may go, your son will live. And the man took Jesus at his word and departed. And so there is the crux of this event that we're going to be looking at today. This man is introduced as a royal official, or in some translations, a nobleman. This identity is vague. It's uncertain, and I kind of wonder if maybe it's intentionally so. It might be that John is wanting us to generalize who this man is and not pay too much attention to specifically who he is. So he leaves this somewhat vague as far as this man's identity. Presumptively, this is most likely a Jew in the service of King Herod, who was an agent, of course, of the Roman government. But we can't know a whole lot about his identity for sure. What we do know is that his son is very sick. According to verse 47, this boy or this child, we don't know his age, he was nearing death. We don't know much about the nature of the illness itself, other than when he is healed, the servants report, and this is down in verse 52, they report that he had a fever that left. So we know that it was some sort of a febrile illness, but we don't know much more than that. So what does this father do after learning that Jesus is back in the area, is back in the region? Well, he travels presumptively from his home in Capernaum to Cana, and that's a 13.5-mile trek. It's not, we wouldn't think much of that today. It's about the distance that I drive to get to the church building every Sunday, so I'm sorry, I said 13.5, it's 16.5, so it's a little bit farther than I drive to the church building. But it's not that far if you have an automobile. But on the other hand, if you're going on foot or on donkey, that's a different story. That's a bit of an undertaking. So this father was very concerned about his son's situation. Verse 47, this word that says he begged him to come. This word is also translated as besought. The official besought Jesus. The official implored Jesus. And what this means is that this individual was pleading for his son in an urgent and a persistent manner to Jesus. This was not something he was going to give up on. He was passionate about this situation. He really wanted his son to be better. What did he want of Jesus? Well, verse 47 tells us clearly he wanted Jesus to come and heal his son. And I want you to notice that word, he wanted Jesus to come and heal his son. At this point, whenever Jesus has done a healing, at least in the Gospel of John, we know that he has been present for that situation to be remedied. And so the healing touch of Jesus was just that. It was associated with a physical touch, with physical contact, with Jesus needing to be present at the place. But also notice that even at the onset of this, in order to undertake those actions, traveling there, pleading with Jesus to heal his son, there's some faith that's already there. And this official is demonstrating that he at least has what we referred to earlier in the book as miracle faith. He knows Jesus is capable of doing supernatural things. Verse 48, Jesus makes a comment, and he generalizes this. Notice in verse 48, some verses just say, unless you see miraculous signs and wonders, but other translations will say, unless you people. The reason that's correct is because this is a plural word. So he's not just speaking about the man who's asking to heal his son. He's generalizing this and saying, unless you people see miraculous signs and wonders. He's speaking to anybody that's listening, everybody that's there. Unless you see these miracles, signs, you will never believe, is what Jesus says. So it's important for us to see that he's not chastising the man. He's making a point to the people who may be gathered around. And so they are just in the same situation as many were in Jerusalem that had what we termed miracle faith. They were going to believe only to the point of Jesus being able to do these supernatural healings. Jesus' point, on the other hand, is that it's not about the healing. The healing, the miracles are signs to point to who I am, and that's the important thing. The important thing is to see who Jesus is and to begin to believe that, not just in his supernatural power, but to believe everything else about Jesus. So his challenge for this official is to take his faith deeper than just a miracle of healing. Let this miracle function as the sign it's supposed to be. Let it teach you about who Jesus really is. And I kind of think that John, as he includes this part of the message. I think he's doing that for all of us who would live after the time of miracles has ceased. Okay? And he knows by the end of the first century, when he's writing this, that those types of miraculous events have pretty much gone as the apostles have died off one by one by one. Okay? And so it's important for the world now to see that faith is possible and in fact expected even if there can't be miracles. Okay? So that is where Jesus is at. And I want to remind you of something. We're going to come to this later on. But this is late in the book of John. We see John pointing out why he wrote these things. We see him talking about the importance of believing even when there wasn't any physical touch associated with that. And what I'm referring to is in chapter 20, after Jesus has met with Thomas, and Thomas has thrust his hand into Jesus' side, and of course at that point Thomas exclaims, "My Lord and my God." And so Thomas now has been brought to a point of faith, but he's been brought to that point again by being able to see and touch something that was spectacular. But what Jesus says to Thomas is this, and this is in John 20:29. Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." So John has an interest in prepping the gospel for us so that we can understand that we indeed can enjoy a life of faith even though we don't see those same purposeful miracles that occurred in the first century. Okay. So Jesus reminds the audience that they need to believe and not just trust the miracle. But the royal official in verse 49, he's persistent in what he wants. He comes back and he says again, "Sir, come down before my child dies." And now we get to verse 50, and verse 50 is the turning point of this whole scene. And Jesus just simply gives his assurance, "You may go, your son will live." And so what this man is being challenged to do here is Jesus has said it's taken care of. Will this man trust his word, or does he still need Jesus to go with him? Does he still need Jesus to show up and do something physically and touch his son? Or is his word enough? And of course, the outcome here teaches us that his word was indeed enough. And so Jesus agrees that he will heal the child, but he's not going to do it in the way that the man wanted it done or expected it to be done. So Jesus does not go with him, but the official, it says, and this is still in verse 50, the man took Jesus at his word and departed. And so in spite of no physical evidence yet, the man agrees to depart in peace, and he took Jesus at his word. That means that he's fully expecting that his son is recovering. Okay? Now there's a couple of important applications to this faith lesson for us. First of all, faith doesn't require direct physical miraculous signs. But what it does require, it requires us to be convicted that he is reliable. And when he says something, that's exactly what is going to happen. And in fact, his faith is going to have to go another step beyond that, not just to when he says something, but just knowing that Jesus is present and involved in a situation is enough, whether he says anything or he doesn't. Okay, so that's something coming later. But remember the words of Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1. And in one of the more modern translations, it says this: faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. So even when the outcome isn't seen we know what's coming. And that is what true faith is all about. The second application I want you to see here is, do we trust Jesus to do things His way? And I would dare say that a lot of times when we ask in prayer for something from the Lord, we ask not only for the outcome, but we also ask for how it'll get accomplished. And quite often, He has a different idea. This reminds us of the story of Naaman in the Old Testament, when he went to the young servant girl, and the young servant girl told her about a prophet, and he found out that in order to be cured of his leprosy, he had to go wash in the Jordan River 7 times. And of course, Naaman didn't want to do that. The Jordan was a dirty river. He wanted to stay in one of his rivers of Assyria and wash in cleaner water. But, you know, we often want the result. We want to be healed of the leprosy too, but we don't want to go through the Jordan to get there. We want to do it in our way, in our time. When we pray for things, we must learn to trust God for the outcome that will be best for us, and also it will be accomplished in a process that will result in our maturing and our growth, okay? And we can trust and know that that will be accomplished. It will not necessarily be the easy way. It will not necessarily be the quick way. It will not necessarily be the least messy way or the least painful way. But it will be the lesson and the mechanism that will do us the most good in the long run. And that is a lesson we need to see from this. We have to learn to trust God without infusing our own expectations or placing conditions on Him. That is not easily done. One other verse that I want to bring into this discussion is from 1 John. This is 1 John chapter 5 and verse 14. The last half of it. If we ask anything according to His will, then He hears us. It doesn't say if we ask anything willy-nilly. It says if we ask according to His will, in His way, in the way that He chooses to bring us an outcome that's best for us, and through a process that will bring about our growth and our development, and it will cause me to be a stronger Christian person tomorrow than I am today. This official is a great example for us because of what it says at the end of verse 50. When Jesus says, "You may go, your son will live," the man took Jesus at His word and departed. It's just that simple. The third part of this story are to notice the 2 important outcomes. And this is chapter 4, verses 51 through 53. While he was still on the way, and this is the royal official who is now returning home, while he was still on the way, his servants met him with the news that his boy was living. And when he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said to him, "The fever left him yesterday at the 7th hour." Then the father realized that this was the exact time at which Jesus had said to him, "Your son will live." So he and all his household believed. So the first outcome that's important here, of course, is the physical outcome. And the son was healed apparently instantaneously at the same moment that Jesus from 16 and a half miles away had said, "Your son will live." And so when Jesus said to the man, "You may go," that's exactly what He meant. This thing is settled. This thing is done. It's over. And it's important for us to see, as John is portraying this event, he's once again giving us good, solid, strong evidence to believe it, okay? Because notice these servants who wind up serving as powerful witnesses, they are completely unbiased. The servants who come to meet the official, they have no idea what has taken place in Cana. They just come to the official with the news that your son got well at this time exactly. So they were totally unbiased witnesses in their story. And John includes that information so that we can see the truthfulness of what actually happened. Once again, and we've seen that throughout the book, that John includes details that help us see the supernatural being real. So these guys knew nothing of what happened in Cana, yet their report matched up perfectly with that of their fathers, the father's experience with Jesus. And so it's interesting that this, what I'm calling a remote healing, it serves a special purpose to add credibility to the actual healing itself, because we have witnesses from both locations coming together and seeing that the details line up perfectly. But there's a second outcome, as we've already sort of alluded to, that is the more important one, and that's the spiritual outcome. The last part of verse 53 says, "So he and all his household believed." Well, it said he believed already. He took Jesus at his word, right? But his faith was deepening. This is a deeper type of belief. His faith is continuing to develop and grow. It's spreading throughout his household. Take a look at how this is maturing as we work our way through this passage. Verse 47, when the man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come. He had enough faith to seek Jesus out and at least ask him to do the miracle. Verse 50, Jesus replies, "You may go, your son will live." The man took Jesus at his word. He no longer requires Jesus to come with him, to be physically present in order to do the miracle. He just simply accepts what Jesus says, and he was reassured by what Jesus told him. And now by verse 53, he has enough faith that he will continue to believe even after the miracle has been completed. And that is what I'm talking about with this progression of faith. There's a type of faith that's miracle faith, which means you see something spectacular, and that is convincing that someone has special power. But then there's another level of faith when Jesus says something to you, whether he speaks to you directly like this man or if he speaks to you through Scripture. When he says something to you, you have enough faith to go ahead and just accept that and do it and understand it. But there's another type of faith that we're going to call, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, probably next week. It's called life faith. And life faith is that faith which, whenever you are confronted by any situation, we recognize that Jesus is already there, that he has it under control, that it's already taken care of, and the outcome will be for my best. And so that is what's called life faith, where you don't even need direct visualization of Jesus. You don't need even the word of Jesus. You're aware of the presence of Jesus in your life, and that's what this sort of third level faith is all about for us. And so, as we said before, this spiritual outcome here is the more important of the outcomes. All right, another important application that I want to give to you right now, and that is, it's just this. It comes from what happens with this man. Even simple acts of faith cause faith to grow. It will generate more evidence. Okay, so think about this man. When he came to Jesus, first of all, just simply going to Jesus and making their request presented an opportunity for Jesus to respond to him, which then took him to a deeper level of faith. And so now he learns to trust Jesus in what he says and what he teaches. And then, because he takes that second step, now he goes home and now he has even a deeper faith, a faith that will last through life, as he realizes that Jesus can be present in any and every situation. And so that is an important lesson for us. Just that the simplest acts of faith give faith an opportunity to grow. It's a process of learning to trust, and it's no different than learning any other skill, even learning to walk. As I watch my grandchildren learn that, it's no different than that. You begin with a small step or two, and lo and behold, pretty soon you're running around the room. And then before long, you're outrunning your parents and your grandparents, right? So it doesn't take long for those skills to be incorporated. Faith is much the same. You just have to take a step. So if you wonder why your faith isn't growing, there's a question for you. Are you stepping out in faith purposefully? Are you doing something new for the kingdom? Are you doing something new for Christ? Because that is when your faith will take on depth. The best way to grow faith is to act on it. All right, and the last thing we see here is the conclusion of cycle 2. And this is verse 54. And what we see here is this is an obvious intent by John to link these events in Cana. He wants us to see these related to each other. And by the events in Cana, we're talking about the turning of water into wine, and then now this healing of this official's son. And what the text says in verse 54 is, this was the second miraculous sign that Jesus performed, having come from Judea to Galilee. Now, if you turn, and we have to take a look at this and how it's been set up. Look back in chapter 2, verse 11. This is after John has given the record of Jesus turning water to wine, and he says that his disciples came to a point of faith, and then it says in verse 11, this, the first of his miraculous signs, Jesus performed in Cana of Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their trust in him. If we turn ahead to chapter 4, verse 46, at the beginning of this episode we've looked at today, verse 46, once more he visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned the water into wine. He is clearly linking these things together, right? And then down in 54, this was now the second miraculous sign that Jesus performed, having come from Judea to Galilee. Now, if you're counting miracles, the miracle of turning water to wine, the miracle of transformation back in chapter 2 was clearly the first. But you remember there were a lot of miracles, it says that in the text, that he did later in chapter 2 in Jerusalem, as he healed many, and many came to a point of faith. So why does John now at the end of chapter 4 say this was the second miraculous sign? Because there was one in Cana, and then there were all these things in Jerusalem, and now there's this one in Cana. It's clearly not the second miracle. Well, read the text carefully. It says this was the second miraculous sign. This is chapter 4, verse 54. This was the second miraculous sign that Jesus performed, having come from Judea to Galilee. So just as in cycle 1, when Jesus came up to Galilee, landed in Cana, turned the water into wine, again in cycle 2, he goes to Judea, he comes back to Cana, and now in Cana he performs this miracle, and it's the second one he has performed upon his return from Judea. The other miracles aren't included. So John is putting these two miracles together. Why does he give these two signs such prominence? Well, I think there's two possible reasons. First of all, it emphasizes the differences between what's happening in Galilee versus Judea. And we talked about this very early on in the book, that this is a book of conflict, and that every time we go to Judea, that conflict gets stronger. and more passionate. Okay? Galilee is a place that Jesus could almost escape to, and it was relatively safe compared to Judea. And we are intended to see the differences in these two locations and the two areas of his ministry. But the other reason that I think these two signs at Cana get linked together is to help us see this cyclic nature that we've been talking about. And whereas in the early part of the book, in cycle 1 and cycle 2, which we now conclude, whereas these are very important to see the overall thrust of those cycles, they will become more rapid and less critical to our understanding of the text from this point going forward. But at least for these two cycles, it's really important for us to see that Jesus went through this process of, in the first cycle, making disciples and then returning to Cana to demonstrate his transformational power. And then in cycle 2, we see him making and influencing people in Jerusalem, out in the Judean countryside, and then up in Samaria, and eventually he winds up back in Cana, where again he's able to perform a very satisfying miracle, but more importantly, he's causing faith to grow in people. Okay, so that concludes our look at cycle 2, and next week what I want us to do, and this is going to be a little bit different. I haven't asked you to do any homework in a while, but I am going to ask you again this time. What I would like you to do for next week is I want you to read, let me see if I can find it here. I want you to read this whole section of cycle 2. Because we've sort of spent all of our time taking this apart and looking at it in minute detail. I want now to come back to it and take a look at this whole cycle from its beginning to its close. And I want you to identify, I want you to read it, and then I want you to identify those things that John is trying to show us by putting these events together. What are the common threads that run through these different events? This is not an easy question, I'll tell you, but it was a very rewarding one. And then next week what we will do is we will see how your list and my list compare. So we conclude cycle 2 today. It's all about giving different types of people different opportunities for faith. And that is what Jesus is looking at in my life and in yours. Will you trust him? Don't forget, God is good all the time.